This podcast is brought to you by the Albany Public Library main branch and the generosity of listeners like you. What is a podcast? God, Daddy, these people talk as much as you do. Razib Khan's unsupervised learning.
Thanks for listening to the ungated version of the Unsupervised Learning podcast. If you want to read some essays on some of these topics, please check out razib.substack.com. Again, that's razib.substack.com. Thank you.
You know that genetics plays a huge role in our health, and more people are using genetic testing to determine risk for diseases like cancer for themselves and their kids than ever before. So I want to tell you about Orchid. It's the only company that does whole genome testing for embryos, testing before your child is born. If you're doing IVF, this is a clear choice now because now you can reduce risk for thousands of single gene disorders, including heritable forms of autism, pediatric cancers, and birth defects. Check them out at orchidhealth.com. Hey, everybody. I am here with Alex today, who I follow on Twitter and has a lot of great content related to dating. He runs the date psychology website, and he has a master's degree in neuroscience. And he follows a extremely interesting area of literature, which I am not very familiar with. So I'm excited to learn a lot, Alex. Is there anything else you would like to say to introduce the listeners of the podcast to you?
That's perfect. Really, that's about it. We could dive right.
All right. All right. Sometimes I talk about things that maybe are a little abstruse to people. I mean, I hope not too abstruse, but selection sweeps in certain parts of the genome or something like that, and I have to unpack a lot of things. I do think they're interesting, but they require a little bit more handholding, I think, maybe of the general public. You do not talk about something like that. In fact, you talk about something that I feel kind of like personality psychology. I had a personality psychologist on actually recently, where people feel like they know a lot about it. They have a lot of opinions, and I don't know a lot about it, and I don't like to offer opinions about areas that I don't have good scientific or scholarly backing in. Partly because life is short. I would rather like to zoom in on the most probable truth rather than some intuitive anecdotes that seem to circulate in certain parts of the interwebs. So, for example, we are both on the X website, the erstwhile Twitter website. And one thing, especially when it comes to male-female relationships, is that basically you can find every single potential opinion on that website, and every single potential opinion on that website also gets massive amounts of engagement. Things that I believe are 100% wrong get massive engagement. Things that I believe are probably right get massive engagement. Things that I don't even know how to unpack and I don't even understand what they're trying to say, mostly Zoomers that are using weird words, I also see them getting lots of engagement. I would love this podcast to get a lot of engagement. Obviously, engagement's great, but what I like about your account is there's data there, and that's great because people are interested, and you're doing the hard work of actually spreading the scholarly information out there. One thing I want to ask, and I think you actually tweeted about this today, but this is the first thing actually I want to get to. So there's something called the Pareto principle. And basically it's, like say 20% of academics produce 80% of the publications, 20% of humans produce 80% of the crimes, et cetera, et cetera. 2080 is, a rough number you see, but it could be 1090. But the point is, this is like this exponential output, this power law of a few individuals producing most of the output, most of the signal. In the dating environment, what is often said is there's a lot of hypergamy going on, and a small number of men. So the utility of these apps, because they're apps now mostly, is high, but that utility on the male side accrues to a few males. And this has resulted in a lot of conversation. The incel movement is obsessed with this fact. And so I was just curious, what do you know about it?
Absolutely, sure. So on the apps, yeah, that's what we see is that, a large percentage of men get no matches, and a small percentage of men, kind of like you said, about 10%, get a lot of matches. and kind of between those two, not quite as many matches. So on the one hand, yeah, that's kind of what we see, particularly for men on these dating apps, is that they don't seem to work for a lot of men. And yeah, that has produced a lot of discomfort, a lot of angst and dissatisfaction with dating apps specifically, as a lot of men go on them, they put their profiles up and they see, I haven't gotten more than one match in a month. I haven't gotten many matches. And, in past environments, perhaps people never got that kind of feedback where it was like, how attractive do people find me? How desirable am I as a mate? And now they realize, wow, no one seems to like me. And it kind of gives that picture, in it's a very superficial environment. It's about photos, very quick photo judgments, swipe left or swipe right. And in that, certainly you see kind of that outcome where, a select few percentage of men are kind of overperforming on the apps and others aren't. When it comes to actual sexual behavior, it's a little bit different. And there we do kind of see the Pareto principle that you have the so-called promiscuous 10%. And really it's more closer to about 20% of individuals that are engaging in casual sex. And that's about the same for men and women. Whereas the rest are either not having sex or they're engaging in mostly monogamous relationships, one partner over the course of the year, serial monogamy. But you do have, again, that select 10, 20% that are overwhelmingly promiscuous. Yeah.
Well, I think the dating apps, what you're describing is they're kind of a very particular, strange dynamic. They're culturally very salient. People talk about them all the time. These companies like OkCupid, Bumble, Hinge, they're very, very well known. I feel like my friends that are urban cosmopolitans, this is how a lot of their dating life works. It's just that's how people expect it to be, and it always has been. Obviously, it has not. And it's one of these situations like social media, for example, is considered by many younger people and older people kind of harmful. We can agree or disagree on that. That's not the point. But a lot of people feel like, well, there's no option. They have to be on it, So let's say you're a journalist and you hate X. You got to be on it. You got to be on X, or, if you want to see pictures of your friends as they're raising their families or whatever and keep in touch with them. Facebook is still useful for that. I know it's a little bit cringe and, Zoomers and younger people don't use it that much. But once they start having kids, I think it'll change a little bit unless they want to leverage Instagram for that. But anyway, my point here is network effects are real. And it seems like these dating apps are hated and used simultaneously. It's ubiquitously used. It's one of those situations. What do you think?
Absolutely, yeah. There's a large survey that found about 50% of couples meet online now, and other data sets show a little bit lower for apps specifically. That asked about online, which can also be other online venues like social media, but other surveys have found between 20, 30% of couples now meet on apps. So it's almost like for many people, yeah, if you want to date, it means dating on an app. And that I think is especially the case as people become more involved in work. Perhaps, a very common pattern is friend groups shrink as people get older. And given that, fewer adolescents are going to parties, social events, and all of that. And it's like, how do you meet people in the modern environment? Well, dating apps are one huge way. Social media is another large way. And yeah, on the one hand, people are very dissatisfied with the apps. They're very unhappy with them. And then on the other hand, it's like, yeah, if I want to meet someone, I got to be on the app.
Yeah, you make an interesting point, which a friend of mine observed. I live in Austin. A lot of friends that are on Bumble, which I think is Austin based. And couple of things. I have one friend, and he met his girlfriend through Twitter. I'll call it Twitter right now because it was called Twitter back then. And I have many friends who say that Twitter is a dating app. Obviously not for most people. Most people don't have big accounts, but for a non-trivial minority of people, they use it that way. I actually have some friends. I think they listen to this podcast. I know they have a subscription. So they met in a reply thread that I had with the editor of Quillette, Claire Lehman. That's how they met, because they were replying to me and Claire, and then they started engaging each other, and we just ignored them. And now they're married, and now she's pregnant. So Twitter is also a dating app. The flip side is I have a friend who moved to Austin, young woman, late 20s, that's what I'll say, moved from the West Coast, kind of abruptly, just wanted to live in Austin after the pandemic. And so she got on Bumble and she went on a lot of dates, has not found her forever person or whatever you want to say. But a lot of her social circle, most of the guys that she dates, like, she does not know anymore, obviously. But there's some of them where the relationship didn't work. They didn't like click, they didn't match, but they remain friends. And she's created like a lot of her social network out of guys that she originally dated. And so Bumble is a friendship app. It's a social media app, right? And what I'm pointing out there is all of these apps, all of these connecting tools are used in very similar ways by different people, even though obviously their origins and their optimization might be towards one modality.
Absolutely, yeah. I also know people on Twitter that met on Twitter, people who have followed my account or that I've seen on there. And you always see people post things like that. And they're like, this is how it began and this is how it is now. And they show their wedding rings. And it's really common, yeah, that people seem to meet on social media. I think that kind of how do couples meet? And it says they met online, 50%. Well, if we know that about 20 to 30% are on dating apps, then we know, probably the remainder is from social media. It seems to be a really big way. And the same for connecting with friends. I think especially as isolated as many people are now, as much time as they spend on social media, they're probably forming larger friend groups on social media, even if they don't meet those individuals in real life. In many cases, they probably do go on to meet them. But in that case, it also acts, as a global network for building friends.
Okay, so Alex, in terms of our conversation, I started out with the Pareto principle and whatnot, but I want to ask you about hypergamy. Again, a lot of the conversations are driven by, candidly, angry men on the internet, and they talk about how these bitches are, forming into harems around these alphas, and a lot of it's like pretty crude and reductive. But hypergamy is a real thing. Mammals tend to be polygynous. We ourselves empirically are not as polygynous, actually, and you can tell by the size difference. And we can talk a little bit about that later. But tell me about the empirical reality, because this is why I'm talking to you. The empirical reality of dating apps and hypergamy.
Sure. So yeah, the idea that women select up. So what do we see there as far as dating apps? Most of the research on this, on hypergamy, has to do with selecting up for status. So we see selection up for educational level, income. When we look at actual mating patterns, it tends to be pretty assortative. So people tend to select individuals of a similar level of income, similar level. We don't tend to see a huge amount, but we do see that preferences are expressed for that, right? That women would prefer to have a man who makes more, prefer to have a man who has a higher level of education and that sort of a thing. And in dating apps, those things do come out. Profiles that put a higher income or in experimental conditions that put a higher level of education, they do get more matches. But I think what people often refer to in dating apps is essentially more attractive individuals. And I wonder to what extent that is really hypergamy, because hypergamy is kind of a selection up from where you are, rather than just a simple preference across the board for more physically attractive individuals. Because there's not a lot of research that calls selection for attractive individuals hypergamous, so to speak. But yeah, everyone shows a strong preference, men and women both, for more attractive individuals. And more attractive profiles, men and women both, they get many, many more swipes, they get more messages and all of that. So men and women both are trying to shoot their shot with the most attractive people. Men seem to be much more willing to swipe right, and approve of profiles that are not kind of in that top tier. Women, of course, are much, much more selective in that case. But as far as actual couple formation and all of that, at least off of the apps, we tend to see people pick partners who are similar in their own level of attractiveness. And that might not be because they don't prefer the supermodel or whatever, but that's because, what life gives to them in that sense.
Yeah, I mean, this is well before dating apps. It's as back when I was a youth in the 1990s, or some comedian was everyone tries to pull in the best that they can get, with what they are also bringing to the table. It's a negotiation, and you have your cards, and you're trying to get the best draw. And so it is what it is. I mean, sometimes there are outliers, like when you just see physically, but then it's a cliche, but it's often true. Those outliers, there's something else going on there that you might not know about. The rich guy. I live in Austin. There are some really, really well off people with really, really nice sports cars, and I mean, they're generally fit. They have trainers, but we definitely see like literal hypertrophy. But I think in terms of the ubiquity online, what I hear the people complaining about is, as you said, that these alpha guys, these chads, they cast a wider net. They might not settle with the lower mate value woman, but they will, have a one night stand. And the women are not, and this is also like tied to certain levels of misogyny. The women are delusional, and they think they're going to be able to like hook them, but they never do, and they're just using them as opposed to like settling for someone. Quote, I'll just use the word settling, who's like more in their league, and that way like they could actually have like a legit bond and have a real relationship. Does the data speak to any of this? This is a whole scenario I see people ranting about constantly.
Sure. So yeah, that's definitely one of those narratives out there that top, 10% of men on apps is essentially running through all of the women. And when I think this is based largely on just looking at swipes and match rates, but that's limited data because it stops there. Everyone that you swipe on, it doesn't go on to have messaging. It doesn't go on to an actual meetup. And when you begin to track the data to messages sent, phone numbers exchanged have been tracked in some papers, and also surveying dating app users and saying, how many sexual partners have you had from the app? Then you begin to see a much closer 1-to-1 ratio. So it seems like most people on dating apps are actually pursuing pretty monogamous patterns where, one man meets one woman and they're going out and either they're hooking up or they're forming a relationship. Similarly, most individuals on dating apps report that they're using it to find a relationship rather than for hookups. And you do see a pretty big sex difference there. In the recent Pew data from 2023, I think it was about 30-something% of men said that they were using it for hookups, but only 18% of women did. So that's another thing also, is that most women, and this is very consistent across the research as well, are just not that open to having a bunch of hookups and that sort of a thing. So it probably is the case, that there are women that are going on dates with men that don't want to continue to date them, and that those women are perhaps not swiping on men who might be more in their own range as far as attractiveness or whatever the case may be. But I don't think there's a lot of evidence for that so-called Chad harem scenario where, a small percentage of men are monopolizing all of the women.
So I've been alluding to incels and whatnot. It's the whole thing. And just I think most people will know what I'm talking about, but these are involuntary celibates. They've always existed in some ways, but now they're a social movement. They're an identity because everything has to become an identity. Arguably, it started with Elliot Rogers, who you can Google him, but he wrote a manifesto, and online the incels, treat him as a hero, even though he was a mass murderer. He basically killed a lot of young men and women in Isla Vista, California. It's a suburb, I guess, of Santa Barbara. And so it's in Southern California. Elliot Rodger himself was not ugly, actually, or repulsive. I'm straight, so I can't say if he's handsome or not, but I mean, he was not heavy. He had reasonable, normal features. He was psychologically very abnormal. It's quite clear. You could say he has like some severe form of Asperger's. I'm not an expert on him, but the little things that I've heard described in his behavior, I've known of people. I work in tech. I've known of people with non-pathological or non-psychopathic tendencies that are similar, though. In terms of antisociality, like difficulty engaging with people on their own level in a way that allows them to relate and integrate. So I just wanted to like preface this with this whole incel thing. A lot of them, they again talk about looks and, these women will only get with chads. But I mean, I know guys that are like out of shape, not making that much money, that have decently attractive, maybe not supermodels, but decently attractive girlfriends. How does that happen? And a lot of it is just they're normal. They have normal hygiene. They know how to like flirt and be funny, all of those things. I mean, this is cliche, but true. So, have you, I know you're focused on dating, and incels by definition don't date, but has the rise of the incel movement affected dating insofar as, certain men are just pulling themselves out. Because sometimes I see, and like, you don't know what on Twitter, on what X is real or not. Sometimes I see people, actually, I know, I'm not gonna lie, I know someone in real life. I'm not gonna say who it is, although some of my listeners would know the Twitter handle. And he's open about it on Twitter too, somewhat. I think he would say he's an incel. Like Elliot Rodger, he's not offensive looking in any way. He's not overweight. He's actually quite thin. Regular job. He's just filled with rage and self-loathing. I mean, I know he doesn't listen to the podcast, so I can say this. We're not like super close, but and I've told him, I'm like, oh, look, your problem is attitude, bro. So this is my only like personal experience with someone I would say would be identified as an incel, but they're all over the internet and maybe they talk a lot. But I mean, have they like started to quantitatively affect dating in any way, or maybe how women view men? I don't know. Or is this just an online thing? I know in Korea it's become like a social political thing. And Korea has the lowest fertility in the world now, South Korea. But in the United States, is this just a Sturm und Drang online, or do you see it in the data in some way?
It's hard to say how it's affected dating overall, all of this discourse. I don't know if it's in any of the data. These are very popular narratives, incels for one, and also MGTOW, men going their own way, as well as, the manosphere more broadly, the red pill, where you have these narratives about dating and romantic relationships that are extremely cynical. And, some of these men still choose to date, but they take a very cynical attitude, whereas others are saying, drop out, don't do it. And I can't imagine, with as popular as these narratives are, and as popular as this media is, that it doesn't impact dating in some way. In the recent Pew survey of singles, it found about 60% of young men, about 20 to 30, were single, but about half of those young men said that they were not trying to date. So we know that a lot of single young men have deliberately dropped out. We don't know why. They didn't go and ask them why, but I think there are examples, kind of like you said, as far as the attitudes of incels. In one of the surveys I ran, I looked at hostile attribution bias, which I think is kind of relevant to the Elliot Rodger thing. So the idea is, individuals that have higher hostile attribution bias, they tend to interpret ambiguous or neutral behaviors and stimuli as more hostile, right? So in his manifesto, one of the things that he said was kind of like, he would see a couple sitting together and be like, they're making fun of me. Look at them being so happy together, and they're looking at me and thinking of me. And that seems very typical of someone that has kind of that hostile attribution bias, because probably that couple has not even noticed him. They're not thinking anything negative. They're probably not thinking anything at all. I think that's kind of one of those things that we see. Certainly, research on incels and mental health has indicated very high rates of anxiety, autism, high rates of depression. So like you said, Elliot Rodger, he wasn't a bad looking guy, but, serious mental health issues. And I think, there hasn't been a study to date looking at the attractiveness of incels, their faces and that sort of thing. So we don't really even know if the population is more or less attractive than average. We do know a little bit about their mental health, but what I suspect there is probably if you have people that are a little bit lower in attractiveness, and you have people who also have mental health issues and hostile attribution bias, they also score very high in hostile sexism, which is kind of like the classical thing we tend to think of as like sexist, like men who dislike women, as opposed to just like more broadly sexist attitudes that feminists might call sexist, but like serious dislike of women. And I think, you get a mix of those things, and it's going to make it really difficult to kind of form healthy relationships, I think. I guess one other thing to consider as far as that, like you said, yeah, we see people who seem mismatched as far as attractiveness. And one thing we know about assortative mating is, people end up with partners similar in attractiveness, but they're less similar if those people have known each other a longer period of time. Why is that? Well, people get together as friends or something like that. Maybe they're not initially attracted, but they build attraction. And that's really important for women as well. So yeah, if you can have positive interactions on a level that's not romantic initially with peers and friends, some of those things will turn into romantic relationships.
Yeah, I mean, it is possible to escape the friend zone. I'm going to give some personal divulging. I've done it multiple times. And also, I've Brett Weinstein, internet public thinker, internet guy, he pulled pulled Heather out of the friend zone. He pulled a robbery. So this is open. I've joked with them on Twitter about it. So, keep hope alive. And, it's like Chris Rock had this is not my typical podcast. Chris Rock had a thing where it was like, someone was like, how come your female friends are always attractive? And he's like, you never know, so you gotta, keep the bench in good health. So what about the decline of sex? Before I want to ask you about some other stuff actually related to what you just said, but decline of sex, is that real? Again, a lot of this stuff I see online and I don't follow up on because look, finite amount of time, but I know there's data out there.
It's kind of real. So we've seen, in the GSS, this chart became very, very famous. It was from the GSS 2018, and there's since been more because of that. And it found, okay, sexlessness rates were skyrocketing for men, but not for women. And this is in 2018. The percentage of men who had never had sex since age 18 rose. But then when I went into that and I looked at it by smaller age groups, yeah, that's pretty much just men about 18 to 20, 22 or so. And then it just kind of drops off. So what really might be happening is the youngest individuals, the Zoomers, are probably kind of delaying sex. They're probably having more of an extended adolescence. And that's reflected in a lot of other trends that extended adolescence as well. For example, getting driver's licenses later in life, going into work later in life, living at home longer, and all of those things. Those are things that will make it more difficult to have an earlier sexual debut. And as far as that, what we've seen, in 2021, women caught up to men in sexlessness. And then in the most recent GSS, 2020, it dropped way back down to only about 10% of men and women had not had sex in the last year. So, we don't really see a consistent trend there as far as like growing sexlessness.
So is it true that men place a higher premium on physical attractiveness and women place a higher premium on, say, career and financial security and whatnot?
It's probably true that women place a higher premium on those things, but it's not quite as clear if men actually place a higher premium on physical attractiveness. And probably some of the best data for this is speed dating studies, where they take samples of individuals, put them in a room, and they have them go on a speed date. So they're interacting with another person in a circle for 5 minutes, and they change partners, and then they can pick who they want to date. And consistently across speed dating research, one of the most robust predictors the most robust predictor of who's going to get picked for a second date, who's the most popular person, is physical attractiveness. And that's true for men and women. So both, and we see the same in dating apps, that attractive male profiles and attractive female profiles, the more attractive, the more swipes they get. So yeah, men and women both seem to value physical attractiveness highly, at least at zero interaction, at that first meeting. So attractiveness probably works kind of like a gate in that case. It's, a bar that has to be passed. Someone has to be attractive enough. Then all of those other traits can come into play, especially for long-term relationships. And I think really the picture we see is that men and women both value physical attractiveness highly, but women care about a bunch of other stuff too that men don't seem to care about as much, right? Or if at all, like status and income and all of that.
I got it. I do have to say, there is, in my, friend circles, I would say there is a positive. There's a strong correlation between social status, kind of like class, background, or milieu, like what they've achieved with people they date. So, for example, I don't know too many like machine learning engineers that work at Google who are dating bartenders, and so obviously I think partly it's like availability bias, right? In terms of like who you encounter. The one case that I am thinking of that is an exception is a guy who's a quantitative finance guy, moved from the Midwest, and his girlfriend moved with him, and they seem to have a long-standing relationship that goes back really far, and she's a server at a restaurant. She doesn't technically need to do that job, but in any case, it just stands out to me because I'm like, what's going on? Everybody else, it's like, not necessarily that they're equal, but college-educated people tend to date other college-educated people, et cetera, or a college equivalent. Like I'm in tech, so there's people that exited at 20, and that's kind of a different category too. Entrepreneurs. So what? Last generation, let's say the year 2000. This is when the dating apps, the dating sites like Match.com and all that stuff, they came about. What would you say have been the most surprising changes? Like, for example, I had a gay friend who said, they said that you people, as in straights, would not take to these apps because, in a way, Tinder was modeled on Grindr, I think. I'm not 100% sure about this, but I think it was. And Grindr is a very different, it's used in a very different way than, say, Match.com. Let's put it that way. And so, I have a gay friend who argues that in some ways, straights are becoming a bit more like gays, like using apps and using, these matching services and whatnot that are automated. And gays have had to do this because they're not always visible and they're a minority. And so it's hard. And J-Date exists for Jews. There's all these other groups that, do actually make these apps. Apps and sites are very, very important for these groups because you can't just like randomly meet them on the street, at work, in your friend circle, But now it's spread to all of society. So that's, I think that, and as you said, 20 years ago, people would like think you're kind of a freak if you married someone that you met on the internet. And today, if you meet someone at a bar and you marry them, people are like, "Whoa, that's kind of weird," So, what would you say are the big changes in the last, say, 23 years? Let's say go from the year 2000.
Sure. So, yeah, I mean, the big one, is that you have a new way to meet people, I suppose, that has become a very large way to meet people. So, yeah, like you said, 20 years ago, it would be really weird to have met someone on the internet. And now it's very, very normal. So that's probably the biggest and most obvious change is this new technology that has kind of brought people together. I think what you said about, I heard that too. I'm not entirely sure if that's correct, but I've heard the same thing that Tinder was modeled on Grindr. And I think that's interesting because you kind of see the sex differences related to sociosexuality in that comparing the two, right? That, any man can put a picture on Grindr. They're going to get a lot of matches. They're going to be able to find romantic partners for long-term relationships or hookups pretty easily because, men are much higher in sociosexuality, much more willing to have casual sex. Men do not have that experience on Tinder with heterosexual women, of course. Men have a really hard time finding casual sex partners on Tinder. In comparison, there was a large study of students in about 2012 that tracked it longitudinally over the next, I think, 5 or 6 years, maybe into 2020. I'm not sure when they ended it, but it looked at fraternity students. It looked at across a bunch of different universities. I think it had a sample of like 1 million or something, if I remember correctly. And they said, okay, did individuals start having more casual sex, and did STDs go up? And very little. There was perhaps a 1 or 2% rise in STDs. There was very little difference in monthly or yearly sexual partners. So perhaps surprisingly is that dating apps haven't changed the environment that much as far as casual sex is concerned, which I think is counterintuitive to a lot of people because we think of these as hookup apps, which is kind of what Grindr is, right? Kind of I think what it is for a lot of people. But, I think that's because most women are not seeking hookups, and just, that's kind of the barrier there, right? That women are the selectors in that case, and women are typically not super open to a lot of casual sex the way that men are. So perhaps that's what's kind of limited it in that sense. But I think, a big change is probably that a lot of people are much more aware of their own mate value, and it's probably given them a very negative perception of their mate value. Probably, I say aware as if it's an accurate picture, but it's probably painted a very pessimistic picture for men who go on the apps. They don't get any matches and they think like, oh, no one has liked me. Like imagine, in the year 2000, if no one in your friend group liked you, you might just think like no one, I haven't met the right person yet because I don't know that many people. If you're like, I swiped on, 30,000 profiles and got 5 matches, then you might start to really wonder like, wow, do women just really not like me? Is my mate value really low? Am I really unattractive? And I think so in that sense, it's probably done a number on a lot of people's self-esteem.
Yeah. I want to say in terms of self-esteem, just random things that I sometimes wonder about. I see people saying, again, I don't know what's going on here, but I see, people being interviewed on social media, just I say average people, but sometimes above average, usually women, for example. And, because like the numbers are easier, I think, to ask women, how much does a man have to make? And, they'll be like, at least $200,000 a year, look, I have friends who are neurologists who are making a lot more than that. So whatever, like, I'm like, okay, that's fine. And then I like look up the stats. I just did now because I don't actually know what the median in Austin is. 45 to 65-year-old is making $90,000 a year for the median. Where and like younger is like is lower, right? It's Austin. It's a little bit more expensive. There's more professionals, I would say. But I mean, that's the 50th percentile. What are the guy? I don't actually. I have look. I have no idea what these guys are doing. Like what? Like, bro, you're making $60K a year. Like, how do you survive? I don't know. It's like I'm not going to turn to communist or anything, but it's just seeming pretty harsh. And then I have friends. I have friends who are just average guys, and they're like, oh, I'm not going to date anyone who's overweight, and I'm just like, okay, well, good luck, because that's a lot of American. You know what I'm saying? I mean, I'm just to be candid about it. A lot of these issues are like, oh, like these women are like, oh, I gotta date a doctor or some stupid thing or whatever, a successful professional, and I'm like, look, there's a lot of guys out there that are not that, and you're competing with, I mean, I know the women you're competing with because I see some of them, in downtown Austin sometimes, or in the Westlake area, whatever, and whatever. And then like there are these guys who are like, oh well, I'm a little overweight, but I would never date anyone who's a little overweight, like not even obese. Like again, I'm thinking about a specific guy. It's like he's basically an incel or he's a volcel. I don't know what you want to call him. It's kind of a joke that this guy is just like never going to date anyone because he only wants to date women considerably more attractive than him, which is a great aspiration. But bro, you're not pulling off. You're not funny enough. You're not witty enough. You're not whatever. You're not charismatic enough. So that's the reality. I think a lot of people don't want to face reality from what I can see. And again, this is just observation, not scientific like the stuff that you look at. But I just want to put that out there. And I think that's also reflected on social media and our pop culture. I don't know. What do you think about that?
The obesity question is really interesting. And, my first intuition with that was like, yeah, how can half of the population being overweight not impact dating in a big way? Because we know, that overweight individuals are perceived as less attractive. And, certainly many people have that feeling like your friend expressed that, I don't want to date someone who's overweight, right? Totally understandable in that case. But so many people are. So does that not kind of shrink the mating pool? I've looked up research like, are overweight individuals less likely to be sexually active? Are they less likely to be in a relationship? And it seemed like they weren't, which was kind of surprising. But just because they weren't, I'm not entirely convinced that there's not something there. I can't see how having half of the population effectively making themselves not just less attractive but a deal breaker to so many people could not impact that in a negative way. As far as income, I think that's probably overstated as an importance. I think a lot of people, and the reason for that, again, kind of going back to the speed dating studies that look at income and people state a preference for income, but who they actually pick to date has almost no relationship with that. Very weak relation. And I think that's because it's not easily assessed at first glance. And I think it's probably, income is important for long-term relationships as far as like the outcomes, like individuals that struggle financially, much more likely to get divorced. Low socioeconomic status, much more closely associated with divorce. If you're struggling financially, that's going to cause a lot of problems in the relationship. It's going to wear you down over time. But for that initial attraction, it seems to be that it's not that important. So, we see all of the videos all the time, of women that are like, I want a, $50,000 diamond ring and I'm only going to date a guy that makes $500K. And they can say that, and they're probably going to meet someone that's like a hot bartender and they're going to be like, I like him. And they're going to date him anyway, regardless of his income. I think that's probably closer to the way that it really plays out. But yeah, as far as someone who is not attracted to someone who's not conventionally attractive, who's overweight, but they're not conventionally attractive. On the one hand, it's understandable because the way that you look doesn't determine who is attractive to you, but the way that you look does determine, if they're going to be attracted to you back. And you both have to have that attraction. So yeah, if you have a lot of obese individuals, men and women both, it's kind of like we have the two sexes making themselves less attractive. And how can that not impact things negatively?
Yeah. Okay. One, we've been talking about dating apps a lot, partly because I just wanted to get some clarity here. But one thing that people often say, and again, like I don't know this world, firsthand. 10 years ago, OkCupid was like some paradise, and all the apps have gone downhill. And what I'm hearing. So, for example, this is something that I'm hearing. If you're a woman, you get overwhelmed with inquiries, no matter who you are, no matter what picture you put. And if you're a man, the optimal strategy is just like swipe, like very, very little filter, just like inundate, Well, so the issue here is women are overwhelmed. They're demotivated to look. Men don't get any responses because everyone is inundating all these women. And so we have a situation where the ecosystem, like a natural ecosystem, has gone through stages and its value is not there anymore. And, again, social media is social media. Facebook used to be not so cringe for young people. They used to use the Facebook. It started at Harvard. It started at, people that are around 20. And now it's mostly grandma that are really active and posting their cringe memes and the news articles and arguing. You know what I'm saying? So the whole ecosystem has changed over time. Have you thought about this, seen this in terms of dating apps and how they've transformed over the last decade? Because it really has been since about 2010 that they've become part of our culture and ubiquitous.
Sure, yeah. Well, something you mentioned that's interesting, that men do have kind of that serial swiping strategy. And then there's been research as well on female swiping patterns, and something, women have been observed, over a series of like 500 swipes. And at the very beginning, they swipe right on more. And the more profiles they see, the less they swipe. So there is an effect where the more male faces they're exposed to, or the more profiles they're exposed to, the more selective they become, right? Kind of a wider mate pool is associated with higher selectivity. And there's theories of that in evolutionary psychology that kind of explain why that is. But we see that empirically as well in dating apps, that this exposure to many potential mates makes people more and more selective. But I guess also related to that, yeah, men should not do that serial swiping thing, as far as I understand, because I think the way that the algorithms work on these apps is that they show your profile. Perhaps, they can restrict your profile or show it to more people. It's not just random, kind of based on your popularity. So if you're swiping on a lot of people, you're not getting any matches. That can actually hurt you negatively. This is what I've heard. I'm not entirely sure if that's still the case. That used to be the advice. So, men should probably think more about, like, is this a realistic person for me to swipe on? Do I actually like this person? And swipe left on some at the same time there.
Well, okay. So, you got a background in neuroscience and behavioral science, obviously. I have friends who are evolutionary psychologists here at University of Texas. David Buss has a laboratory here, so a lot of those people are around. In terms of relationships, dating, the mating market, all these things, what does evolutionary psychology and what does neuroscience tell you that the average person on the street doesn't necessarily know? Because I think, for example, men are much more open to casual sexual encounters. The evolutionary psychological explanation of that relatively straightforward. In terms of before contraception, the risk of pregnancy was borne by women. In terms of outside of a solemnized pair bond or something recognized. You know what I'm saying? I mean, guys be dogs. And these are this is the mammalian behavior. Human males are actually pretty distinct in terms of how much pair bonding and investment we engage in. What else have you learned from the science? What do we trust from the science in terms of explaining relationships? And mostly I've been talking about the American context, but we can move across culturally. I mean, I'm assuming apps are a thing in Europe. I mean, Japanese have weird things because their culture is weird. Stuff that buzzes if someone's open. You know what I'm trying to say? It's they're not quite as outgoing as Americans. Indians still have the websites that they use. I think that the parents are actually. It's kind of weird. I'm sorry, I'm laughing, but I'm just saying it's okay. So you're these parents are looking for people, and the other people are also manipulating the accounts of parents. So that's just kind of weird to me. But what have you seen out there, in the literature, to explain certain things? And I do have a question about what neuroscience could teach us and help us in the future. But I'll let you answer first.
Sure. Yeah, unfortunately, neuroscience is just not well equipped to examine behavior and personality. I was pretty fortunate in the previous masters that I was in. I did personality psychology. So, but yeah, I remember in one of my last neuroscience courses before I graduate, they said, "How can neuroscience tell us about personality?" The professor, and I said, "It really can't. There's not much." And she was like, "Yeah, I kind of agree with you there," because it's so focused on the minutia of the brain and everything. But as far as observing actual behavior is the best way to do it. I think what are some surprising things in evolutionary psychology? I think something that, and it's actually kind of what you mentioned, that perhaps people get wrong. People focus a lot now, especially with all of the online discourse, about casual sex and hypergamy and all of that. And they probably vastly underestimate the extent to which men desire monogamous relationships and which men desire long-term pair bonds, and the extent to which human beings are kind of, so I hate to use the word wired, but that's kind of the way people like to put it, the way that human beings are wired to form long-term relationships, right? That the normal human mating pattern isn't just a bunch of hookups, but it's forming, monogamous relationships, often serially monogamous, but for a relatively extended period of time compared to other animals. I think something else related to that, I think people are very cynical about love as an emotion, but love is one of the emotions very powerful that evolved to facilitate pair bonding. It's something that's very, very real in that sense. I think.
Yeah. Okay. So, you said something about personalities. I do need to ask about this. So I've been thinking. I didn't know much about personality psychology until the last, I don't know, 6 months, a year. Partly it's like my co-founder of my startup is super into it. She was a psych major, and people talk about personalities all the time, Myers-Briggs, but I look mostly at the Big Five or the hexagon or whatever. And it strikes me that there's certain personalities that are compatible, certain personalities that are not compatible. Let me give you an example. So let's imagine someone that's extremely high on extroversion, extremely low on introversion, or no, extremely high on extroversion, extremely high on disagreeability, extremely low on neuroticism, and let's do another three because I don't care about conscientiousness and openness right now. Okay, let's just assume they're both the same, they're average, and then another person that's very introverted, so extremely low on extroversion, also extremely high on disagreeability, and extremely high on neuroticism. Okay, so you have a very introverted neurotic person that's disagreeable, and a very extroverted non-neurotic person that's very disagreeable. My hypothesis is that this is going to be a problem over the long term. Am I wrong?
I think you're right. Yeah. If you, I think, yeah, anytime some of these personality traits, it's almost just like a net negative in relationships across most contexts. If you have someone that's very high in neuroticism, they're gonna have a lot of struggles. If you have someone that's high in disagreeableness, also they're gonna have struggles in their relationship. And if you match those two up together, probably more more conflict between the two. And I think what you described, where you have an extrovert and introvert, high in neuroticism and disagreeableness, kind of paired with the other that's also disagreeable. Sounds like a problem to me.
Well, what is this idea that opposites attract? It's like a pop culture thing, but in terms of personality, is that even true?
No, it's not. Yeah, those are kind of the two narratives in our folk psychology, right? The things that we believe popularly about human psychology, and one, a really big myth: opposites attract, and it's very much the opposite. We see assortative mating, that similarity attracts across personality traits, both in actual selection and in expressed preferences. People tend to want people who are similar to them, who they share things in common with, both as far as their behavior, the way that they are, and also as far as like more concrete things like level of education or hobbies or interests and all of that. And the more similar people are, the longer their relationships tend to last, the higher their relationship satisfaction is, lower likelihood of getting divorced. Probably the only exception there is, we even see assortative mating for antisocial personality traits. Individuals with the dark triad higher, they tend to pick, men or women who are as well. Yeah, in those situations, you probably do see more problems. But even then, you see, attraction to people who are similar rather than dissimilar.
I mean, so this is kind of a silly question. What's up with women in astrology? Do you know? Does anyone know? Is this just, I mean, I think I have friends, buddies who are complaining about like these women, just like they're all obsessed with the astrological signs and alignment and stuff like that. And I'm like, what?
I have no idea. And I've never encountered that. And maybe that's more of an American thing, but I've never run into it. But I do, I do think everyone, kind of like with relationships, I think everyone wants to explain human psychology. Everyone has kind of that folk psychology where it's like, how do we explain the behavior of this person? What are they like? And perhaps astrology functions as kind of a surrogate for understanding personality types, and how they're going to be compatible and work together. And, even if it's not real, it gives people kind of a mental model to work on and a framework to think about those things. Like some people are like this, some people are like that.
Well, I mean, so, you're out there on X putting the info out. I see a lot of engagement, a lot of replies, and you also tend to reply back. With my type of foci, scientific interests, there are certain questions I get all the time, and I have to answer them over and over again. And it's just how it is. What do you get? What questions do you get? I mean, it could be questions that I asked you, over and over again, where it's like just like a never ending source of content and engagement, because it's like people just want to know again and again and again.
I think a big one is on like Bad boys and attractiveness. That's one that people seem to engage with a lot. People want to know, why are bad boys attractive? I think people also want to know, the dating app topic that we've talked a lot about is a really popular one as well. People always want to know, why do men get so few matches? Why do women perceive most men as being low in attractiveness, which is kind of consistent across the research, that women tend to rate male faces low. I think the role of things like height, in general, like how important is being tall to women, or how important is physical attractiveness? Lots of debate on, like, does personality even matter at all? Of course, the research consistently shows, yeah, personality matters, but you have cohorts of individuals who say it's all looks, it doesn't matter. Those tend to be pretty big ones there.
You are a fast and concise interlocutor, I do have to say. No shade on my previous people. I think 150 people that I have talked to on this podcast. Wide range of personalities, topics, and just speaking styles. But I do have to say, Alex, you're a pro at this. You can communicate very very quickly, very concisely. I hope people enjoyed that. I hope they check you out. Especially if I generally find you on X and wherever you are. And I hope you enjoy the winter. This has been really, really informative for me. I hope it was informative for my listeners and viewers. Everyone should follow you. And I hope we learn some new things that are interesting in the coming year. And happy 2024, everybody. And thanks for being here, Alex. Whole genome sequencing is used for adults and children every day to assess risk for thousands of diseases. Orchid, a genetics company led by scientists from Stanford, is able to do this for IVF embryos. Now, instead of waiting for a diagnosis, parents can assess if their embryos have genetic variants known to cause severe conditions before their child's even born. No other tests can detect these issues so thoroughly or so early. So check them out at orchidhealth.com.
This podcast for kids. This is my favorite